Today's objectives are to differentiate between autotrophs and heterotrophs and to investigate the characteristics of a food chain and a food web. There are two types of producers. One type are autotrophs. They capture light energy to make their own food. And a good example of this are all the plants that you see outside, including grass. Anything that we consider a plant captures light energy through photosynthesis and makes their own food. The other type of producer is a chemotroph, and chemotrophs use chemical energy to produce their own food. And a good example of a chemotroph is bacteria. Bacteria uses chemical energy to produce their own food. So the producers had a list of two, which were autotrophs and chemotrophs. Consumers have a considerable longer list. Let's start with the general overview of a consumer, and they are considered heterotrophs, which are organisms that eat other organisms to get their food. So they eat either plants or animals or something else that is living in order to get their food. There are several types of heterotrophs. First up, herbivores. They obtain energy by eating plants only. Carnivores eat other animals to make their own food. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. Think of a bear that eats salmon but also collects berries. Detritivores feed on plant and animal remains and other dead matter. They are also sometimes called scavengers. And lastly, decomposers, which break down organic matter for food, such as mushrooms or other types of fungus. So let's run through a couple of examples of each. A producer, we have several types of plants. It looks like someone's garden. These are all self-energy producing. They're autotrophs. They produce their own energy by capturing sunlight energy. We have an herbivore, which only eats plants, like this cow, which likes to munch down on grass. Mr. Lion here is a carnivore, likes to eat meat or other animals. A detritivore is this crab. It will stay at the bottom of the ocean and it will wait for other things to feed on other organisms, and it will collect it as the remainder of that organism that's being eaten falls to the bottom. We have an omnivore, which is a bear, collects fish and also will eat fruits like berries. And decomposer being a fungus, which uses acid to shoot out of its roots to break down dead organic decomposing matter. Taking all these organisms and putting them in a hierarchy from what eats what is called a food chain. So a food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating organisms and by being eaten by other organisms. The energy stored by the producers can be passed through an ecosystem. So here are two examples of food chains. One is a terrestrial. This picture shows us two examples of food chains. We have a terrestrial, which is a land food chain, and a marine, which is a water food chain. And down the middle, it's telling us what type of producer or consumer the organisms are. And on the left and the right are examples. So let's just take a look at the terrestrial food chain. We start with a plant, which is a primary consumer. This is what usually starts off our food chain. It's a plant of some sort, a producer, or an autotroph. All right. From there, we have consumers, and we just label these primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, going from what eats what. So the insect eats the plant and is an herbivore. The herbivore is getting consumed by the carnivore, which is a rodent. The rodent gets consumed by the snake, and the snake gets consumed by the top level consumer here, which is a bird of prey. Same thing over here. Small gets eaten by the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, the tertiary consumer, and the quaternary consumer. Alright, so when you link a whole bunch of food chains within one ecosystem together, you get what is called a food web. A food web kind of looks like a spider web after you put all the organisms that you're talking about in that ecosystem and you draw arrows to what eats that organism. So note that this mouse eats the acorns. So if you look, the arrow is being pointing to what eats the previous organism. The snake will eat that, and so on and so forth. Now, when we look at this, we are still showing that energy is being passed in a linear fashion. We have bacteria that get soaked up, or compounds, simple chemical compounds that get soaked up by the oak acorns. The acorns get picked up by the mouse, which gets eaten by the snake. We have a salamander that's getting eaten by a snake. We have a bird that's being eaten by a snake. We have a mouse that's eaten by a red-tailed hawk. So these organisms are interlocked within this ecosystem. So a food web just shows basically several food chains that are linked together within that ecosystem. Next up, we have an ecological pyramid, and we're going to take a look at that and also trophic levels. So over here is the ecological pyramid. What it is it's each step in a food chain. So our first step in this food chain are our producers. Our second step are primary consumers. And then our next step, which happens to be the top step in this ecological pyramid, are the top level consumers. In this case, they're secondary consumers. Each level depends on the level below it for its energy. What that means is that the giraffes depend on the producers for its food. If we ever lose all of our producers, everything above it gets affected. So if most of our trees are now lost because of some disease and all we have is grass, our population of giraffes will dwindle because there's not enough food to support all these giraffes within that ecosystem, which means that the lions will also dwindle in population. If we have a nice healthy ecosystem down here that can support a lot of giraffes, then the population may rise, which will also cause the lion population to rise because there's enough food for everybody. Continuing on with the ecological pyramid, only about 10% of the energy available within one trophic level is transferred to organisms at the next level. So only 10% of the energy that is found in the producer's trophic level will be passed on to the giraffes, and only 10% of that energy will be passed up to the lions. So we need to maintain a nice balance between the trophic levels, because in fluctuations, either great or small, will cause drastic changes to each one of these trophic levels. Alright, so today we differentiated between an autotroph and a heterotroph. Autotroph makes its own food like plants. Heterotroph eats other organisms, and there's several types of heterotrophs. And we also investigated the characteristics of a food chain and a food web. A food chain is the linear transfer of energy from one organism to the next within an ecosystem. A food web is considerably larger because it's many food chains that are shown within one ecosystem. If you have any questions, please bring them to next class.